Good morning, Riverside family. Trust you're all safe and well. This is the final series talk of our January focus, which has been on spiritual disciplines, which have all been around trying to learn how to live more like Jesus. So if you haven't seen some of the other slots, I encourage you to do that. Tim was looking at silence and solitude. Ruth, I think, was looking at living simply. Liam at slowing down. Mark last week talked about Sabbath. And today we'll be looking at living generously. So what are we talking about here then? Money, I suppose. Well, maybe not just money. For me, generosity and living generously needs to cover absolutely everything, and particularly the stuff that we think is ours. I don't know if you've ever caught yourself saying, no, that's mine, especially when you're talking to God. Then whatever that is, we need to bring it into line with this idea of living generously. So yeah, of course it covers money. It also covers possessions and stuff that we have. It covers our homes, how open we are, how hospitable we are in terms of sharing what we have. It massively includes our time. We can feel after we've done a day's work that our time is ours. Or when we've been to church and house group and prayer group, we can feel like the rest of our time is ours. It's about how we use our time. It's about our skills, our expertise, our knowledge. I remember on one occasion, a lady gave me a picture. I think it was when I became director of Burton Youth for Christ all those years ago. And the image that she gave was me walking up a mountain. And I had a backpack on my back. And as I was traversing the mountain, I would meet other climbers, other travellers, and they would reach into my rucksack and my knapsack and they would take what they needed out of it. And for me, that's been a really incredibly helpful picture of how to live my life, that I'm trying to scale this mountain, I'm trying to live this life, I'm trying to live like Jesus. And anything that I can pick up on the way is great, but actually it's not just for me. Anything I've got that is useful to somebody else, then they just can come and grab it and use it on their journey to help them through. Maria mentioned when we were talking about this that it could even be with our bodies, generous with our bodies, blood donation, organ donation, things like that. Maybe things that we wouldn't necessarily think of. We need to have a generosity towards others, don't we? Friendships. We need to have a generosity of grace. Generosity is about a focus on the other rather than on me. And that can be words. We can be generous with words, can't we? We can be encouraging and positive and kind and good, or the alternative as well. I think in life as well, particularly if you are in a job or in a role where you have influence, where you have power in inverted commas, I think it's always good to be generous with that as well, and to be looking to give that away, to empower other people, to help them to move forwards. One way of maybe looking at generosity would be that your default mode is yes. So when somebody comes to you asking for something, the default is yes, rather than no. You may end up having to say no, because sometimes we do have to say no, and there is some sense at times in saying no. But very often it's if you've got a default of yes, that's a good place to be. Generosity will cost. There's no doubt about it. But in God's crazy mixed up economy, although it costs us, somehow we get so much more back. whether that's freedom from the control of money, or the joy in giving something that puts a smile onto somebody else's face, or whatever. There is a payback for us, even if it is according to God's economy as opposed to ours. So just because you give away, £100 doesn't mean that you're going to get £1,000 back. It's not health and wealth. It's you give that away, and actually that what you've given away will be rewarded in heaven, if not before. I like to think of generosity as a bit of a spectrum. There's obviously some people who are not very generous. I mean, think about stories like Scrooge and the Christmas Carol. Think about the parable in Luke chapter 12, where the guy has had such a bumper harvest. All he can see is the fact that he's going to be getting more and more and more. So he decides to tear down the barns and the storage that he has so that he can store more, so that he can hoard more. And there's a very simple story where it's very clear, as that story unfolds, that parable unfolds, that God's economy is not the same as ours. Other people are at the other end. Obviously Jesus was at the other end, particularly maybe around his time, the way he gave time to people. Probably didn't have a lot of money. Sometimes that can be easier to be generous. I've certainly seen that in my visits to Africa, where people who have very little are willing to give you something that is really hard to receive, actually, because you know how much that costs them. But Jesus was very generous with his time. So Francis of Assisi is a great example of somebody living very, very simply and making sure they give away what they have. The priest at the very beginning of the story of Les Miserables was a very generous man, and that's based on a true story, and he often got into a great deal of trouble with his housekeeper, and I think it was his sister who lived with him, because he kept giving away stuff, including the fact that when they lived in the nice vicarage, the priest swapped with the school, which was a tiny little school room, and they moved out of the lovely vicarage, the lovely kind of manse that came with the church, and ended up being in the schoolroom, and the school had the other. So, there are people at different ends of this spectrum. Some of us are moving along it. Hopefully we're growing in our generosity. Maybe we're not. Maybe we're struggling with it. I don't know. We're probably all moving at different speeds as well. I think of the example of Zacchaeus, who was probably at one end of the spectrum, and yet an encounter with Jesus propelled him along that spectrum, so much so that he gave away and gave back far more than he had kind of taxed out of people, even the tax that wasn't necessarily due. Zacchaeus had a heart and a mindset change, and that's what we're talking about here with generosity. I could stand here and tell you to be better at generosity, to give more, to do better, but actually that's not going to have any effect. You could decide that you're going to be better at it and try, but actually it's about a mindset and a heart change, that we realise that actually everything that we've got is a gift from God, and therefore it isn't ours really in the first place. We're stewards of it in a sense. We're looking after it, but actually it all belongs to God, and we need to be asking him how he wants us to use everything that he's given us, to further his kingdom, to grow his purposes and his plans on this world. We've got examples, human examples, like Bill Gates, who spent the first kind of half of his life, probably a bit more than, accumulating and accumulating and accumulating, and has spent the second half of his life trying to give it all away. So lots of interesting ideas and thoughts around what generosity can be and living generously can be. So what does it actually look like? And I guess for me, I was thinking it would be good to look at Mark chapter 12 And the story there, which is not a parable, this is it actually happens. So it starts in verse 41, and it says this: Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins, worth only a fraction of a penny. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, I tell you the truth, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all of the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all she had to live on. And that's a really challenging story, isn't it, for people like us in the Western world, who are actually probably in the richest 5-10% of the world. Even if we don't feel like it, even if we feel like we're struggling, we're probably still in that category. But Jesus commends this generosity, this lady's generosity. She gave everything, all she had to live on. We would probably call that foolishness today, or even recklessness. But again, we need to remember generosity and living generously in the way that God is asking us to isn't rational, it's not logical, it's countercultural, and it's counterintuitive. It's kingdom. So wherever you are on this scale of generosity and living generously, what I would say is start small in terms of thinking how you can be more generous. So, you can't give all of your money away in one go. I think that would be pretty foolish, probably. But then maybe that's exactly what God's asking you to do. So should we dismiss it? Should we take that away? If you don't give anything, to charity or to church or to God in any sense, then start however you can. Start small. People talk about tithing, so giving a tenth of what you earn to God. And that's a really interesting concept. It's something that I've tried to do in my life, I must admit. But what's really important there is that just because you give 10% doesn't mean the other 90% is yours. Okay? That's a start. It's a good discipline to have. It's a good way to look at giving and to learn the principles of giving, if you like. But it isn't like the gold standard. It's not, if you do that, then everything's okay. I would say God's blessed me and us as a family because we've always sought to tithe. But equally, that's not to say that at times we haven't struggled. At times we haven't had to really trust God that at the end of the month we will have enough money to live on. So, it doesn't guarantee anything in that sense, but it does certainly grow faith and grow your dependency on God. Equally, again, I don't want to make this all about money. So some things I would say is, yes, it's great to say buy a homeless person a cup of coffee or a sandwich or whatever. But what about then taking 10 minutes with them whilst they drink the coffee and eat the sandwich, to hear their story, to put a value on them as a person? That 10 minutes of your time is almost more valuable probably to you and possibly to them than the buying of a coffee and a sandwich. It's important, I think, to be spontaneous in our giving. We need to be aware of what God's saying to us, what he's prompting us for. We all have opportunities to be generous, to be kind, and I think it's crucial that we're looking out for those opportunities. I think one of the things that direct debit giving and standing order givings to church is almost means you don't miss it. It's a transaction. It happens, and it doesn't always have the impact on us that it can. And so I think it's important that yes, it is a discipline to give, but actually we need to be getting the joy and we need to be spontaneous in our giving, and that's the kind of opportunities that provides us with that sense of joy when we've gone over and above, when we've done something that we feel God's asked us to do, and we can see the impact of it there and then right in front of us. I'd say experiment with it. Try lots of different things. If you haven't given blood, try it. Maria's brilliant at it. I'm lousy at it. If they take a syringe full of blood from me, then I tend to pass out and be useless for days on end. But if you can give blood, do it. I know there's some fantastic examples within Riverside of things like that. Try new forms of generosity, whatever it is, in all of those categories that we talked about. Time, maybe commit yourself to doing something new that you haven't done before that you think might help somebody else. It could be shopping for a neighbour. It could be sitting on the board of a local charity. It could be using your skills and your expertise in a variety of different ways to help other people. God is no man's debtor, absolutely not. And I know that whatever form the repayment takes, whether it's a sense of joy, whether it's a sense of freedom that you're not controlled by this stuff and by money, if it's a sense of a growing in kindness and goodness and faith and peace and love, then it is totally worth it. If it throws you onto God, more and more dependent on Him, that's a good thing. It can bring you closer connections to other people. Again, what a great outcome of living more generously. The final kind of picture that I have had of around generosity is that generosity is about pouring yourself out, all that you have out, in the service of God and in the service of others. And there's always that question mark, isn't there? Well, what if I run out? What if I run out of time? What if I run out of money? What if I run out of kindness to give? And I guess that's where this sense of living generously fits into all of the other things we've been talking about in January. Because if we're going to live generously, and if we're going to pour ourselves out as an offering to God, then we need to make sure that we are totally connected to Him, and that we are continually going back to Him for a top up, so that He is pouring Himself into us, so that we continue to be able to give, not of us necessarily, but of what He's given us already. And that's really what generosity is all about. It's about slowing down. It's about silence and solitude with God. It's about simplicity, living simply. It's about Sabbath. It's about finding, I think as Tim said right at the beginning, the unforced rhythms of grace in our lives, so that we can be hearing God and knowing what He's calling us to do, prompting us when and what He wants us to give and to offer to help somebody else. So I'd encourage you to go on a journey where you deliberately need to depend on God to come through for you in certain circumstances, whether that's with increased wisdom, or whether that's to get you through to the end of the month, to payday. Put your trust in God, put your faith in God, and be a person who seeks to live generously for the good of those around you. Let's pray, shall we? Father, thank you that you've poured yourself out for us, that you pour yourself out into us, that you held nothing back, Lord, in coming and living on this earth, living as a human being, setting us an example. Thank you. Help us, Lord, to catch that spirit of generosity that you have towards us and towards the whole of your humanity. Lord, help us to catch that sense of living generously, that we might pour ourselves out, Lord, in service of you and service of others, in seeing your kingdom come on this earth. And we ask that in Jesus' name. Take care, Riverside family. God bless.